Imagine this. It's late at night in a small mountain village. The last embers are burning out in the hearth, and the houses are quiet. Suddenly, the silence is broken by the sound of hooves, footsteps, and torches. Ottoman soldiers descend like a storm. They're not here for taxes. They did not come for grain. They came for something far more valuable and far more terrifying. In a moment, families are dragged out of their homes. Mothers scream as their sons are torn from them. Fathers who try to resist are killed in front of their children. The soldiers have lists. The names of the boys in each family are already marked. This is not chaos. It is order. It is policy. Then begins a journey so cruel, so systematic, and so carefully hidden behind the golden domes of Istanbul that it forces us to ask, what really sustained the power of this empire? For 6 centuries, the Sultan's empire ruled 3 continents. Its armies terrified kings. Its riches dazzled Europe. And its palaces and mosques still capture the imagination. But behind this splendor lay another empire, one built on silence, fear, and broken lives. The story you are about to hear was not recorded by enemies. It comes from the empire's own archives. Cold documents that describe in detail how boys were gathered, trained, sold, and destroyed when they lost their value. This is not just a story. It is a warning about how any power, if left unchecked, turns children into commodities, suffering into currency, and cruelty into law. The soldiers moved through the villages according to schedule. Each settlement was marked in advance in the registers, where families, the number of children, and even the age of each boy were meticulously recorded. The imperial officials left nothing to chance. They knew who they would take and when. An ordinary family had no chance of hiding their son. Even if they managed to take the boy to the mountains or secretly smuggle him into a monastery, there were always informers. One informer was paid enough to provide himself with food for many months. Thus, neighbors betrayed neighbors, and communities destroyed themselves from within. Soldiers burst into the house and acted coldly, as if they were performing a simple accounting task. The boy was led out into the light of the torches, and his face, skin, and teeth were carefully examined. If the child seemed suitable, his name was entered on the list, and a note about the family was made next to it. The parents tried to beg, throwing themselves to their knees, but in response they were beaten with rifle butts or sabers. The worst began when one of the adults dared to resist. In front of the whole village, soldiers tied the man to a pole and executed him publicly. It was a message. The empire doesn't just take children. It breaks the will of entire communities. No one explained to the boys what was happening. They were torn from their familiar world, from the courtyard where they played, from the arms of their mothers, who screamed until they were hoarse. They were led away into the darkness in a column, bound with ropes. In one night, the village could lose dozens of children, and in the morning, the streets were silent, filled only with the cries of women. For the empire, this was just the beginning of the process. For the families, it was the end of their future. When the columns of boys reached large cities, the next phase began, the complete destruction of their past. Each boy was lined up, his name was written down, and he was immediately given a new name, a Turkish name chosen from a list. The old names could never be spoken again. Any attempt to use the name he was born with was punished with whipping or deprivation of food. The empire understood perfectly well that in order to create an obedient servant, it was necessary to destroy the child within. Therefore, everything that reminded the boys of their families was taken away from them. Crosses were torn off and thrown into the fire. Their hair was cut short, and their clothes were replaced with identical coarse shirts. Speaking their native language was forbidden. If someone accidentally uttered a word in Serbian, Albanian, or Greek, they were immediately beaten by other boys, older ones, who had gone through the same ordeal years earlier. The empire turned its victims into overseers, so that the cycle of destruction would never be broken. Training began with the basics, endless drill exercises, prayers in a foreign language, rules of obedience. But gradually the emphasis shifted. Senior mentors taught the young to be humble, be silent, and serve with their eyes and bodies. Any hint of resistance was punished publicly. Not only the guilty party was beaten, but also those standing nearby, forcing them to hate each other. The hardest part was the realization that there was no turning back. Boys who tried to escape were caught by soldiers and returned beaten, sometimes with brands burned into their skin. They were paraded in front of the others as a living example of what would happen to anyone who disobeyed. Gradually, the children's sense of belonging faded away. They forgot their native songs and stopped remembering their parents' faces. Their souls were broken as methodically as a wild stallion is broken. And only when the past was completely destroyed did the next stage begin, training in the art for which they had been taken away. When the boys ended up in the palace or in special schools, the most terrible stage began, their transformation into toys for pleasure. First, they were made to believe that their bodies no longer belonged to them. Their mentors, former captives themselves, already broken, explained that from now on, they existed only for their master. Every movement, every glance had to bring joy to the one for whom they were destined. Training began at dawn. The boys were forced to wash for hours in cold water, rubbing their skin with oils and fragrant herbs. The empire attached great importance to appearance, a clean body, smooth skin, and the absence of even the slightest flaw. This was followed by lessons in music, dance, and refined manners. Boys had to be able not only to remain silent, but also to entertain and delight the ear and the eye. But all this was only preparation for the main thing, the art of submission. The most beautiful ones were sent to the palace's private chambers, where the senior concubines taught them what the textbooks did not cover: how to sit at the sultan's feet, how to touch him to make him smile, how to obey his every gesture, even if it meant pain. Resistance was not tolerated. Those who refused were starved, beaten, and kept in solitary confinement. Sometimes boys were tied to columns and left in plain sight of the others so that they could see what disobedience meant. Gradually, fear became a habit. The children learned to smile when everything inside them was screaming. The empire knew that only those who learned to pretend would survive. The documents preserved in the archives describe this training in dry terms: preparation for service, the art of consolation, training in politeness. But behind these words lay nights of humiliation and violence that the boys could never talk about. For the Sultan and his entourage, these young captives became a symbol of power, proof that the empire was capable not only of conquering lands, but also of turning human lives into playthings. Not all boys remained in the palace. The empire was vast, and there was demand for living goods everywhere. Therefore, special markets gradually emerged, which were rarely mentioned in official chronicles. They were no different from ordinary bazaars where carpets, horses, or spices were sold. Only the goods here were different: children and teenagers. They were lined up in rows, like animals. In front of each one stood a small board with a mark indicating their age, origin, and quality. A fortune was paid for beautiful boys. Their prices sometimes exceeded the cost of a house or a caravan of camels. The rarest ones, with perfect facial features or a special eye color, became the subject of auctions, where the rich competed in greed and vanity. Rumors of such markets reached Europe. Merchants wrote in their diaries about strange rows of children where crowds examined their teeth, felt their hands, and checked the smoothness of their skin. Everything happened openly, without shame, as if it were part of everyday trade. For provincial governors, buying boys was a way to show their loyalty to the sultan. For military commanders, it was a means of maintaining power over their soldiers. For wealthy merchants, it was a symbol of luxury and status. Secret establishments that held dozens of young captives at a time occupied a special place. These establishments operated under the patronage of high-ranking officials, and the income from them went to the treasury. In this way, the empire turned the suffering of children into a source of profit. Every time a boy passed from hand to hand, he lost a part of himself. The empire deliberately deprived them not only of their freedom, but also of their human dignity, turning them into commodities with price tags. And the most frightening thing was that people got used to it. On the streets of Istanbul, you could see processions where young boys were led on ropes, as if they were exotic animals. For the city's residents, this became a normal part of life. Yet another reminder that the Sultan's power extended even to the souls of children. Beauty and youth were the only value these children had. But the years passed quickly. By the age of 17 or 18, their attractiveness in the eyes of the nobility was considered fading. Then a new, even more terrible chapter in their lives began. Those who still had strength and health were resold at a lower price to minor officials, merchants, or military officers. Their price fell like the price of an old horse. No one treated them as rare treasures anymore. Now they were just leftovers. But the worst fate befell those who became a burden or posed a threat. The older concubines knew too much. They had witnessed the Sultan's secret feasts, heard conversations, and kept memories that could become dangerous. Special methods of disposal were devised for such individuals. Sometimes it was slow poisoning. The poison was mixed into the food in small doses so that death would appear natural. Sometimes they staged accidents, falling from a terrace, drowning in the Bosphorus, being attacked by wild animals while hunting. And sometimes spectacular shows were staged. Older boys were forced to fight each other to the death for the amusement of the lords. The defeated boy died, and the victor was granted a short respite until the next fight. There were also those who were sent to special institutions, brothels, for military personnel. There, former concubines served until they were completely exhausted, until their bodies turned into shadows. Some were sent to distant garrisons, where they became gifts for local rulers or commanders. And all this was accompanied by the ruthless coldness of documents. The archives contain records such as depreciation, write-off of property, transfer to a new owner. This is how the state referred to living people, as goods that had lost their luster and needed to be replaced. The worst thing was that the boys themselves understood this. Each of them knew that time was against them. The older he got, the closer the moment when the owner would decide to get rid of the unnecessary toy. And so many lived in constant fear, a fear of death that was worse than death itself. Not all boys died in palaces or marketplaces. There were those who survived, but only as shells of their former selves. These people were referred to in documents as broken. They looked younger than their age, but their eyes were empty. Many could not string two words together. Others trembled at the sight of any man in uniform. Some rocked back and forth in a corner for hours, repeating the same phrases over and over. Modern doctors would call this severe psychological trauma, but at the time it was considered a natural consequence of service. The empire even created special shelters where such people were kept for the rest of their lives. On paper, it looked like care, expenses for food, clothing, security. In reality, however, these were prisons for those whose souls had been completely destroyed. But perhaps even more frightening were the consequences for the villages and families from which the boys were taken. Generations lived in fear. Mothers were afraid to give birth to sons, knowing that one day soldiers might knock on their door. In some regions, birth rates fell, with families consciously limiting the number of children they had. Entire communities gradually died out, torn between poverty, fear, and the constant threat of losing their future. The system was so comprehensive that even the church sometimes became part of it. There were priests and monks who secretly collaborated with imperial officials. They provided information about families and children and helped select the most beautiful and healthy ones. In return, they received money and protection. The betrayal of spiritual leaders shattered people's last hope. After all, if even the temple no longer protects you, where can you run? All this created an atmosphere of eternal terror. Every child lived with the thought, "One day they will come for me." Every mother woke up at night to the creaking of doors, thinking that the soldiers were already nearby. Thus, the empire controlled not only the bodies, but also the minds of entire peoples. And therein lay its true power, the power of fear, elevated to the level of state policy. The story of forgotten children is not just a tale of the past. It is a mirror in which we see how far the state can go when its power becomes unlimited. The Sultan's empire knew how to impress the world with its magnificent mosques and palaces, and how to conquer new lands and riches. But its true power was based not only on its army and gold, it was built on the broken destinies of boys turned into living resources and on the fear that paralyzed entire nations. The cruelty of this system was not a secret crime committed by individual sadists. It was legalized, documented, and supported by religion and bureaucracy. This is what makes it even more terrifying. It was not a personal whim, but official policy that was considered the norm. These boys never became men in the full sense of the word. Their names, families, and futures were stolen from them. Their bodies were used for pleasure. Their youth was sold in markets, and their maturity was destroyed like useless junk. And attempts were made to erase their memories along with them. But the memory has survived. It lives on in the records of diplomats, in the letters of travelers, in the cries of mothers who for centuries have passed down stories of their stolen sons. It reminds us that behind the facade of any great civilization, darkness may lurk. And today, as we tell these stories, we are doing what the empire itself feared. We are returning to the world the echo of their pain, which for centuries they tried to silence. Their names may be forgotten, but their pain is a lesson that must not be lost. Because the main revelation of this story is not about the past, but about the present. Where power knows no bounds, where silence becomes law, new, forgotten children may appear again.